Are today's events the final nail in the coffin for the BBC? It certainly has been an excruciatingly embarrassing day for them, with two huge reports coming out which are pretty damning. First of all, we've had the report come out following the 7-month investigation into allegations against Gregg Wallace, and more than half of the allegations against him have been upheld. And then, just to add to the embarrassment for the BBC, we've also had on the same day another report come out saying that the BBC did in fact breach its editorial guidelines over this Gaza How to Survive a War Zone documentary, where you had the son of a Hamas minister narrating the show. Could this be curtains for BBC Director General, the big boss, Tim Davie? This follows the huge saga over Bob Vylan's performance at Glastonbury, where he shouted "Deaf, deaf" to the IDF, and the BBC did not cut the stream. So there have been a lot of mishaps for the BBC coming out in the news over a very short space of time. So, what is going on with Gregg Wallace? Gregg Wallace, after this report has come out, has said he feels deeply sorry for causing any distress, and that he never set out to, quote, harm or humiliate anybody. And more than half of the allegations against him were upheld, as we said. We're going to have a look at exactly what detail we have about what those allegations are, and talk about whether these allegations really are that serious, or if this just is a huge fuss over somebody making a few crude boys' locker room jokes. We're going to look at what's going on with the Gaza documentary as well. But before we get into it, if you're enjoying this video, make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss out on more news updates like this. So let's take a look, guys, at the details of this Gregg Wallace case. So the claims related to inappropriate sexual language and humour, 1, to unwanted physical contact, and 3 were about being in a state of undress. And we've got more details here. So 78 witnesses were interviewed and gave evidence. 41 of those were complainants. Gregg Wallace was interviewed. He was grilled for 14 hours. So this has been very, very thorough. And there were 83 allegations in total against him. That is a heck of a lot of allegations. A heck of a lot of allegations. 45 upheld. So, the allegations upheld include 12 claims he made inappropriate jokes and innuendo. Do you guys think that that is an offence that should make you lose your job, have this huge expose in the media? I don't know. I think that if you're on telly, I think if you're making really inappropriate jokes live on air, then that is of course going to be a problem. You know, on TV, you've got to have your wits about you about what is appropriate to say and what is not appropriate to say. But just in the workplace, I think, you know, we all have friends, we all have workmates who make innuendo jokes and whatnot. And I'd like to think, you know, we're adults. We can make the odd funny joke, and if a joke goes too far, we say to our mate, "No, that was a bit too far. Can you maybe hold back on that?" Rather than really escalating it, going to bosses and whatnot. So, not sure about that, but we don't know if the people making these allegations did have that conversation with Gregg and say, "Not sure about that joke. Do you think you could maybe tone it down a little bit?" We don't know all the details, but this is what he's also had allegations upheld for. 16 reports he made sexually explicit comments. Again, I don't know exactly what those comments are and how serious they were. May have been something quite mild, may have been something very inappropriate. Now, the allegations on the rest of the list are the ones that do concern me. So 2 allegations for sexualized comments, 2 or about someone. When a joke becomes personal, potentially a joke about, you know, a woman's body, especially, you know, her you know, more sexual parts, especially if it's in front of other people, that can be, you know, deeply embarrassing and humiliating. There were 4 complaints upheld that he made culturally insensitive or racist comments. I don't know exactly what those comments were. Maybe he said something that was genuinely racist. Maybe he made a mild joke that someone, some little Karen, made a huge fuss over nothing about. We don't know. It's hard to say. There were 3 claims about him being in a state of undress. That I find weird. I find very, very weird. But maybe, we've all had, say, some guy at the gym or some guy at the running club decides to work out topless, and you don't really like it, but you don't think this is some kind of evil predator, and you might tell them, like, hey, can you put your top on in here? Was it a case that whilst he's just getting ready for the show and whatnot, maybe he walked around in front of colleagues with his top off? I don't know. Or was he going around, with his part showing? It could be far more serious. We don't know. 7 allegations of bullying. That is concerning. That is not just a joke. That's something directed specifically at a person. But again, we don't know exactly how serious this supposed bullying was. 1 allegation of unwanted touching. That is concerning. But even if individually some of these allegations are not that serious, when it all stacks up to 45 allegations against you upheld, that is looking quite serious. And what we're hearing is that what happened at the BBC is that they didn't, until 2016, have any kind of really formal process to deal with complaints like these. So you had members of staff making complaints about Gregg Wallace, but it wasn't really being recorded anywhere. And then someone else somewhere else down the line makes another complaint about Gregg Wallace, and it's treated like it's a first complaint, like, oh, we might have a word with him, but it's probably all right, rather than them seeing, oh, this is clearly escalating, this is stacking up, we've got this whole file on the computer where we're keeping track of all the allegations we're receiving about Gregg Wallace. That means that these allegations that mostly all occurred between 2005 and 2018, nothing was really done about them until towards the end of that period. I believe around 2018, 2019, the BBC then did have a strong word with him and say, get your act together. Why did it take that long for them to do something? I think, regardless of whether we think that this whole long list of allegations against Gregg Wallace, whether we think they're super serious or not, I think it's fair to say, if somebody makes an allegation, even if it is just, look, I don't like the jokes he's making, I think they're going a bit too far, they make me feel a little bit uncomfortable, even if you don't think it's that big of a deal, you'd think, okay, I might just have a quick word with Gregg, I'll just pull him aside, even if it's nothing super formal. You might think, oh, I'll have a word. But it's sounding like he wasn't really given a word until 2018. Is this another case of the BBC thinking that their top stars are untouchable? Hugh Edwards, even, if people working there did not know about, the explicit images and whatnot until he was arrested by the police, still when he was working there, we hear that people did know at the BBC that he was creepy, that he was weird around young male members of staff. He was creepy. Yet they didn't really do anything to stop him. They thought, he's our top guy, he's our top presenter, he's untouchable. Kind of same with Jimmy Savile. People knew, or at least that's what we hear, people knew that Jimmy Savile was up to no good, but they thought, he's our superstar, he's untouchable. So they don't listen to these, young, unimportant members of staff that are trying to say, help, there's something going on here. So even if the claims against Gregg Wallace are far less serious than what Hugh Edwards did and what Jimmy Savile did, what it shows is that the BBC clearly has a problem about not doing anything when its top presenters are behaving inappropriately, even if it's a serious scale or a not so serious scale, in the case of some of the things Gregg Wallace is being accused of. Now, is Gregg Wallace throwing his toys out the pram in denial? There's been so much controversy about his comments about his autism diagnosis, people saying he's using autism as an excuse for deeply inappropriate behavior. Well, he found out earlier, I think he found out a few days ago, that he was not going to be he was gonna be axed. He wasn't going to be the presenter anymore. They'd made their decision, and he started defending himself. So, in a statement, Gregg Wallace has said, let's read this out. Some of his humour and language missed the mark, but he said, after nearly 20 years on MasterChef, I now see that certain patterns, shaped by traits I have only recently begun to understand, may have been misread. So misread is not a very strong word. He's not saying, I recognise my behaviour was deeply inappropriate. He's saying, okay, I see maybe you read my joke the wrong way. Okay? So doesn't sound like he's really accepting this. He said a late autism diagnosis had helped him to understand how he is perceived, saying that the corporation, the BBC, left him to be exposed to trial by media. So he's not happy about the huge backlash he has had. He's lost his job. He's probably not going to get another gig. If you guys have been checking out his Instagram, you may have seen he has now resorted to selling like online health and fitness courses to try and make a few quid. I don't know how that's going for him. He says this has been brutal for a working class man with a direct manner. Modern broadcasting has become a dangerous place. I was the headline this time, but I won't be the last. There will be more casualties if the BBC continues down this path, where protecting its legacy matters more than protecting people. For my part, with full legal support, I will consider my next move. So sounds like Gregg Wallace there, not in a good mood, saying the BBC has thrown me under the bus to protect its reputation. They should have protected me more. Whilst a lot of people are asking the question, did the BBC protect him too much? They had complaint after complaint after complaint against him since 2005, and they did nothing until giving him a word of warning in 2018. That 13 years to actually tell him, get your act in order, Greg, is quite something. On this point about the autism, there are two sides to this. I'd say on the one hand, I can give him a bit of sympathy in that I totally understand that people with autism, they don't know how a joke is going to land. They don't recognize if something they say is inappropriate and offensive. They're not good at reading the room. But on the other hand, he has had a huge number of complaints, and a lot of people are saying, well, it's not the case that everyone with autism behaves this way. That simply doesn't excuse it. What I would say is that when you have people in your circle who are a bit on the spectrum, we all have people that we know are a little bit on the spectrum, even if they've not got a diagnosis. You've always got to have people in your life who don't quite understand how their words land, aren't quite good at reading the room and recognizing other people's emotions, realizing that something hurts someone. It is people need to take some responsibility and step in and tell that person that wasn't right. You may not recognize that, but that's deeply offended somebody. Can you maybe not talk like that in the future? It's not clear to me that happened with Gregg Wallace. We hear all these complaints were made against him. Is it the case that those complainants went to Gregg Wallace personally and said, can you change your behaviour, before they made a formal complaint about it? Or is it the case that Gregg Wallace didn't even know for years that people were unhappy with his behaviour? The BBC just sat on it, and Gregg Wallace thought his behaviour was absolutely fine until, 13 years after the complaints start, somebody actually tells him, Greg, what you're doing is not appropriate. That's not clear to me. I have some sympathy for him if nobody bothered to tell him that his jokes were upsetting people. So we don't have all the details, and maybe we'll never know. But let me know what you think in the comments. I've been looking on Twitter, and a lot of people are saying, are actually standing on Gregg Wallace's side in this, saying, the BBC is more interested in this whole Gregg Wallace saga than they are about the grooming gangs and serious issues that we should be facing as a society. This is just all noise over a few laddish jokes. Also, there is the argument to be made that times have really changed when it comes to what jokes are appropriate, right? There are jokes that you would make even 5 years ago that are not considered appropriate today. We're talking about jokes from 2005. I mean, when I was a kid and a teenager in school, we made jokes that we wouldn't get away with today. They'd be considered inappropriate times of change. So I think there's something to be said for that. But there we go. That's the latest. Now onto the Gaza documentary. These two reports coming out on the same day. I mean, regardless of whether you're on Gregg's side or you're on the BBC side, in this, I think we can all agree it's pretty embarrassing for the BBC that report coming out, and then having this on the same day, a report coming out saying that 3 members of the production company that made that BBC documentary, they knew about the role of the boy's father. They knew he was a Hamas minister, but apparently nobody at the BBC was aware. Now, does that excuse the BBC? Are they saying this is the production company's fault? No, the BBC, ultimately, they choose to commission a programme. It is their responsibility to make sure that the production company that they employ is taking the appropriate casting procedures. They are checking everyone who is involved in the show. And we're not just talking about some sort of extra in the show, happened to be the son of a Hamas minister. We are talking about the main face of the show, right across the front poster. You'd think they would check who this kid is. And look, you guys will know, I did the Channel 4 Go Back to Where You Came From documentary. We went through so many checks. We had a million checks on who we were, and it was not just the production company who were checking who we were. Channel 4, the commissioners at Channel 4, they had to sign off on all of us. It's not like everything was down to the production company. Channel 4 took responsibility to make sure that the people that were going on the show were the right people. The BBC in this case clearly failed to have the oversight that they should have done. So the report says it criticises the BBC for not being, quote, sufficiently proactive with initial editorial checks, and for a, quote, lack of critical oversight of unanswered or partially answered questions ahead of broadcast. Pretty embarrassing stuff, ladies and gentlemen. So let me know in the comments below what you think is going to happen next. Is Tim Davie, the BBC boss, is he going to fall on his sword? Is he going to go after these two things? And what is going to happen to Gregg Wallace? What are the public going to think about this? Are they going to side with Gregg Wallace, or are they going to side with the complainants? Either way, pretty embarrassing day for the BBC. I'm Chloe Dobbs. Thank you for watching this video. We'll of course be covering all new news stories coming out over the coming days, weeks and years. We're here every day, so make sure you subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss out on anything. See you next time.